welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most formative and, honestly, one of the most complex conflicts of the entire 20th century. We're talking about the 1948 Palestine War. You see, this was a war that did so much more than just reshape a map. It literally forged national identities and, well, created wounds that, even today, haven't really healed. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the key events, the different phases, and the outcomes, all based strictly on the historical record. Okay, so here's what we've got on the agenda. We'll kick things off with the UN's plan to partition the land, then we'll look at the long road that led to war. After that, we'll break down the conflict into its two very different phases, see how a brand new map came out of all the fighting, really dig into the human cost, and wrap things up by exploring why this history is, well, still so intensely debated. So where did this all really start? The immediate spark, the thing that really kicked it all off, was a decision made at the United Nations back in November 1947. You have to remember, after decades of simmering tensions under British rule, the international community basically decided to step in with a pretty dramatic proposal. And the reactions? Well, they couldn't have been more different. It was like night and day. The Jewish leadership, look, they didn't get everything they hoped for, but they accepted the plan. They called it the indispensable minimum. It was their shot at having a state. On the other hand, the Arab leadership was firmly opposed. No way. They rejected the whole idea of splitting up the land, and frankly, they didn't believe the UN even had the right to make that call. Let's look at how the plan actually broke down the land, because this is key. The Jewish population made up about a third of the people there, right? Around 32%. They were allocated 56% of the territory, though that did include the massive Negev desert. The Arab population got 42%. And Jerusalem, that was supposed to be the special international city run by the UN. As you can imagine, this division, especially the land allocation, was seen as completely unfair by the Arab side. And it was pretty much the spark that lit the fuse for immediate violence between the communities. But here's the thing. This conflict didn't just pop up out of nowhere in 1947. Not at all. The roots of it go way deeper. We're talking about 3 decades of tension building up under British rule. This timeline really paints a picture of how things just kept getting worse. It all starts back in 1917 with Britain's Balfour Declaration. Then you get the British Mandate, which opens the door for a lot more Jewish immigration. And, you guessed it, more tension. There were clashes and violence in the 20s, but that was really just a warm-up for the huge Arab revolt in the late 30s. The British cracked down on that revolt, and they did it brutally. A crucial consequence of that was that the Palestinian Arab community was left much, much weaker, just 10 years before the big war was about to break out. Okay, so the war itself, it's really a story in 2 parts, 2 very distinct phases. It starts out as this kind of local, internal fight between the 2 communities as the British are on their way out. But then it morphs into something much bigger, a full-blown war between nations. And you can see that change really clearly here. In Phase 1, you've got Jewish paramilitary groups, the main one being the Haganah, which was the underground army for the Jewish community, or Yishuv, fighting against Palestinian Arab militias. But then Phase 2 hits and everything escalates. Suddenly, it's the brand new Israel Defense Forces against the actual armies of 5 neighboring Arab countries. And look at the numbers for peak strength. It's pretty interesting. By the end of it all, the Israeli forces actually outnumbered the combined Arab armies. So let's just nail down that timing. Phase 1, the Civil War, kicks off literally the day after the UN vote. The British are leaving, there's a huge power vacuum, and both communities are fighting for control. Then comes Phase 2, the Arab-Israeli War. This starts the instant Israel declares its independence on May 14th, 1948. The very next day, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invade. So during that first Civil War phase, the fighting was just incredibly fierce, very localized. Arab forces managed to blockade Jewish Jerusalem, which was a huge deal. You had 100,000 residents there basically cut off. The Zionist forces responded with something called Plan Dalet. Now, officially, this plan was about securing territory and key roads. But how it was actually carried out is, well, it's one of the biggest debates among historians. Was it a defensive move, or was it, as some argue, a plan to expel Palestinians? It's a hugely contentious point. And tragically, both sides committed horrific massacres during this time, which just created more fear and pushed more and more people to flee their homes. So after more than a year of just brutal fighting, the war finally comes to an end. But, and this is a big but, it doesn't end with a peace treaty. Not even close. Instead, you get a series of armistice agreements in 1949. These basically just froze the conflict in place and drew new, supposedly temporary, borders right on the map. These new lines became known as the Green Line. And what was the result? The Gaza Strip ended up under Egyptian military control. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was taken over by Transjordan. So the state of Israel was now a fact on the ground, a reality. But that Arab state that the UN had planned for, it never happened. So here's the bottom line. The war completely changed the map. Remember the UN plan? It gave the proposed Jewish state 56% of the land. Well, when the dust settled from the war, Israel controlled 78%. That military outcome is what defined the borders of the region for the next 20 years. But of course, wars aren't just about lines on a map. They're measured in lives, in families uprooted, in futures lost. And the 1948 war, its human cost, its demographic impact, was absolutely profound. And it affected everyone involved. During the fighting, more than 700,000 Palestinian Arabs, they either fled the violence or were forced out of their homes in the areas that became Israel. This huge displacement is what Palestinians call the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. And it created a refugee crisis that, as we know, is still with us today. For the brand new state of Israel, just surviving came at an incredible cost. Over 6,300 people were killed. That's soldiers and civilians. Now, to really understand what that number means, that was about 1% of the entire Jewish population at the time. Think about that. For a brand new country fighting for its very existence, that is a truly devastating loss. And the story of displacement doesn't end there. After the war, a second refugee crisis began to unfold. Across the Middle East and North Africa, hostility towards Jewish communities that had been there for centuries just exploded. In the years that followed, something like 700,000 Jews either fled or were expelled from Arab and Muslim lands. Most of them ended up making their new home in Israel. And all of this brings us to our final and maybe the most complicated part of this entire story: memory. You see, the actual fighting might have stopped in 1949, but the battle over what it all meant, over what you even call it, that's a battle that is still going on. And this right here just lays that divide bare. For Israelis, this is their war of independence. It's the heroic foundational story of their country, a small nation fighting for survival against impossible odds and winning its freedom. But for Palestinians, the very same events are the Nakba, the catastrophe. The moment they lost their homeland, their society was shattered and they were dispossessed. It's the exact same set of events viewed through two completely different and irreconcilable realities. You know, the historian Avi Schleim puts it perfectly. He says the conflict over 1948 isn't just about disagreeing on facts. It's about each side subscribing to a completely different national story. It's a fight over the very meaning of what happened and why it happened. And that leaves us with this final thought. To even begin to understand this history, you have to grapple with a really difficult truth. There isn't one single story of 1948. There are two. And those two stories are tangled together, they're unresolved, and they're still absolutely central to what's happening in the region today. All right, well...